Nothing needs a trick but a trick. The Walking Purchase of 1737. In a book of wisdom and advice, William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, wrote, "Nothing needs a trick but a trick. We must take care to do right things rightly." William Penn was a great man and lived by such lofty principles even in his diplomacy with the Native Americans of Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, Penn's descendants and the settlers that came after him did not always follow Penn's principles. The best example of this is the Walking Purchase of 1737. The Walking Purchase, one of the most notorious land frauds from the colonial era, expanded the colony of Pennsylvania, but failed to fulfill William Penn's vision of diplomatic and fair dealings between the colonists and the Native Americans, and in turn heightened hostility and division in the colony. In the late 1600s, England claimed ownership of the Atlantic seaboard of North America by right of discovery. They needed people to control parts of these lands, so on March 4, 1681, the King of England signed a charter for William Penn, giving him the land called Pennsylvania. William Penn was a member of the Religious Society of Friends, which is also called Quakers. Quakers believed strongly in the promotion of peace, that all men are created equal in God's eyes, and that there is goodness in all people. William Penn applied those Quaker principles in his diplomacy with the Native Americans of Pennsylvania. Todd Galley is the curator at Pennsbury Manor, the homestead of William Penn in Pennsylvania.
One is spiritual. He called it a holy experiment. He wanted a place where the guiding principles of the Quaker philosophy of religion could flourish. They were Protestant dissenters in England. They were not Anglicans, and therefore they were treated very badly under various toleration acts that were passed after the fall of Oliver Cromwell. They could be jailed. They could be pilloried. It was just bad for Quakers. So this Pennsylvania was to be a refuge for them where they could come and live out their principles. Second, for William Penn, it was economic. He wanted to make money.
William Penn knew that it would be much easier to sell land to settlers if the Native Americans in the colony were not hostile.
William Penn tried quite hard at being fair and even with the Indians. He paid what he thought was a fair price for the land, and he repaid some Indians several times for the same tract. He didn't view them necessarily as inferior beings, which I think went a long way towards an amity, or at least an initial peaceful relationship between the two.
Wes Dunn is the Vice President and Director of Educational Programs at the Museum of Indian Culture, located in the Lehigh Valley.
William Penn was a very kind, generous man. Like I said, he was a very devout religious man. He saw the Lenape as being very devout and religious. Other colonies did not see him that way. They saw him as savages and treated them accordingly.
The Lenni Lenape Indians were one of the first Indians to live on Pennsylvania soil. They were very peaceful and didn't fight with many other tribes.
The words Lenni Lenape are a redundancy. If you take the word Lenape and break it into its root words are Lenni and Ape. Lenni means the original common, Ape means people. When you say Lenni Lenape, you're saying the original common people.
The Lenape's culture was very simple, but once William Penn came, their culture was changed dramatically. In the fall of 1682, William Penn reached Pennsylvania. When William Penn arrived in Pennsylvania, he was greeted warmly by the Lenape living nearby. The Lenape gave William Penn a wampum belt as part of their diplomacy to symbolize their friendship together. After their greeting, William Penn started to buy land from the Lenape Indians.
The Lenape, and not just the Lenape, but all of the natives, never viewed the perception of, or had the perception of owning the land. They knew they could never own it. They knew they would be buried in it long before they could ever own it. The Europeans were the only ones who had the concept of land ownership.
William Penn traded many items to the Lenape like guns, kettles, duffels, lead bullets, gunpowder, knives, and gold and silver. In one of the treaties, William Penn obtained the land on which he would build a great city. He named the city Philadelphia, which means in Greek, City of Brotherly Love, to show the friendship between the Lenape and William Penn. In another treaty, William Penn bought the land that would be used to build his home in Pennsylvania, which was called Pennsbury Manor. In 1701, William Penn returned to England after his second visit to his colony. Eventually, he was sent to debtor's prison due to financial difficulties arising from mismanagement of his English estates and from the failure of his colony to generate sufficient revenue. Penn died in 1718, and his descendants, led by his son Thomas Penn, were determined to make a profit from the colony of Pennsylvania. Thomas Penn set about obtaining additional land in Pennsylvania that could be sold to investors and settlers. Unfortunately, Thomas Penn did not follow his father's principles of diplomatic and fair dealings with the Lenape, who by this time were called the Delaware Indians because they lived in the valleys around the Delaware River. One of the most famous land frauds done to the Delaware Indians was the Walking Purchase in 1737. The basis of the Walking Purchase was a treaty that William Penn supposedly made with the Lenape for some land measured by how far a man could walk in a day and a half. The colonists played many tricks on the Indians in order to cheat them out of as much land as possible. One trick was that they chose 3 of the most athletic people in the colony to do the walk, and they offered a suitable reward to whoever walked the farthest. Another trick was that they cleared the path of the walk ahead of time to enable the walkers to get as far as possible. On September 19, 1737, James Yates, Edward Marshall, and Solomon Jennings lined up at the starting line of the Walking Purchase, which was marked by a white oak tree. Many Indians thought the walkers were cheating because the Indians thought that the walkers should stop, rest, smoke and talk, and then walk again. After a day and a half of walking and 2 walkers dropping out of the walk, Edward Marshall stopped his walk in the area of Jim Thorpe. After the walk was completed, the colonists drew a line at a right angle to the river rather than straight to the river to trick the Delaware Indians off even more land. No matter how hard the Delaware tried, they couldn't convince the colonists that they had been tricked, so they gave up and moved westward. The Walking Purchase greatly expanded the colony of Pennsylvania. It opened up the Lehigh Valley to settlement and set the stage for the arrival of the Moravian settlers in Nazareth and Bethlehem. Also, by drawing the boundary line to the Delaware River, the colony gained land rich in natural resources that was sought after by the colony of Connecticut. However, the Walking Purchase failed to fulfill William Penn's vision of diplomatic and fair dealings with the Native Americans. The peaceful Delaware Indians were tricked and were driven to western Pennsylvania and Ohio, where they fell under the influence of the French. In 1755, British General Edward Braddock attempted to expel the French from western Pennsylvania and Ohio, but he was defeated. Then, many of the Delaware Indians turned against the Pennsylvania colonists. They burned homes and farms, killed men, women, and children, and took many captives. In the Lehigh Valley, during the month of December 1755, 50 houses were burned and over 100 settlers were killed. The last Indian massacre in the Lehigh Valley occurred on October 8, 1763, at Shites Road in North Whitehall Township. One of the main reasons given by the Indians for their hostile actions was the loss of their homeland due to the Walking Purchase and the treaties that followed. Surely, William Penn never would have approved of the tricks played on the Native Americans in the Walking Purchase of 1737. Even though the Walking Purchase added valuable land and resources to the colony, the purchase failed to conform to the higher standards set by William Penn. If Penn's children had not abandoned their father's principles, the colony may have been spared much of the death and destruction of the French and Indian War.